hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. My name is Hamza Ali. For those of you new to this channel, I review all things movie and TV. So if you like what you hear, share, comment, like, and subscribe. But today we're talking about The Last of Us episode 3. And I guess you really can find love in a hopeless place. And I couldn't believe how, the minute you stop looking for something, it finds you. And this episode snuck up on me for various reasons. Like, it's a long episode, but they don't really waste a minute. And that has to do with how well organized and how well paced this episode was. This part of the series focuses on the relationship between Bill and Frank. And I finally understand what they mean when they say like the eyes are the windows to the soul, because I felt every minute of it. Like this episode transcended like if love could be articulated, I don't know, like this is love. I don't like what if they're like in the dictionary, they should just put this episode. And so the purpose of this episode is like it's a bridging episode, right? It's supposed to kind of start a new chapter between Ellie and Joel. So Joel is done with life. He doesn't care about saving Ellie, and at this point he barely cares about saving himself. And I thought the decision to end Bill and Frank's journey here was a very risky one. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that in one episode, we became not only attached to these characters, but we actually mourned their loss. Like my eyes were like welling up. I was like, I'm not crying, you're crying. And so why did they do it? Let me try to explain as best I can. So when Bill and Frank first take the leap and fall for each other, they're around the piano and they're taking turns singing the song Long, Long Time by Linda Ronstadt. And the song ends, I've done everything I know to try and make you mine, and I think I'm gonna love you for a long, long time. And so Bill, like Joe, is a survivalist. And unlike Joel, he's never really experienced love. Now, Bill, in his letter, like that letter was fire. I felt every minute of it. He said, you know what? Bill hated the world, and he was pretty much happy when it finally ended. That is until he met Frank. So Frank basically became his Sarah, his reason to live again. And what was supposed to be a pit stop for Frank, like Frank had to be on his way, became his final destination. And through Frank, Bill felt he got that rare opportunity to feel like what it's like to care for somebody, but also what it's like for them to genuinely care about you. And when you compare him to someone like Joel, he's already experienced that. He's already experienced this type of love from his daughter, right? And if you recall in the first episode, his daughter spent the whole episode trying to fix his watch for his birthday, to the point where she got really annoyed with Joel when he came home late, right? She was like, why are you late? It's your birthday, here's your watch. Like she really cares about him. Like you had this mutual, like it wasn't just like a parent looking out for their child. Like Joel and Sarah had this connection where like they had each other's back. It wasn't just like father-daughter. It was like it was just love, man. Without his daughter, he struggled to love. So he's just now kind of focused on survival. And now without Tess, he doesn't really even have the will to survive. Like he's kind of done, right? He's thinking like, why am I still alive? Why, like, what's the point of all this? Although they never meet. I think that was the tease in this. Like Bill, Frank, Joel, and Ellie, they never cross paths in this entire episode. However, the story, like the love story between Bill and Frank, I think for me shows how even in the worst of times, there's always something to live for, right? It doesn't matter how bad something is. Like you can't let it kill off your humanity. And living in a pandemic, people have become so ruthless, people throwing each other under the bus, and the problem with that is life has lost all meaning. Like if you're surviving just to survive, you're gonna get exhausted, right? Because at a certain point, you're gonna ask yourself, why am I doing all this? And so Bill's decision to end his life with Frank was a very powerful one. Bill felt that Frank was his purpose, and he felt at peace knowing that he's done his part, right? Like that line at the end when he said, I feel that you are my purpose, like I'm good, like we can just end it here. And his letter to Joel, I feel like was a reminder to keep going until he feels the same way, right? Like don't stop until you feel that fulfillment. Just keep going. People like you are not meant to quit early. Someone like Joel, like he may be down, but the letter reminded him that like men like him are never out of it. And although he may never fill that void left by his daughter, that doesn't mean his life has to be meaningless, right? Like that doesn't mean that like he still has this instinct to protect and to, you know, serve. And that doesn't have to go away, you know? And it kind of revived poor Joel, right? Like he was done. He was really done. So I divided my video into two parts. I want to talk about Bill and Frank first. And then we're going to talk about Joel and Ellie, since the focus was on Bill and Frank. So the relationship between Bill and Frank, like honestly, you could write a dissertation on this entire episode. Like you're watching it, and then suddenly it just hits you. And the second time I watched it, I was equally emotional. And you know, love is a spark. Like you do need a connection between two people, but it's kind of like a spark you choose to ignite. It's like, okay, I have this spark with someone, how do we move forward? And I appreciated the depiction of this because it felt so practical, you know? And I'll tell you why. At the end of their life together, Frank tells Bill, you know what, I've had more good days with you than anyone else. And I think that's the dream, right? To end up with someone that you're attracted to and you also want to be committed to. Like that's a hard sell. And at first I couldn't tell if Frank was playing him, right? Like Frank was coming off like the actor who plays Frank was also in White Lotus. So I'm like, is he just gave me the vibe that he may be up to no good. And as the episode goes on, you realize he is up to good. And when you compare it to like the relationship between Tessa and Joel, like that's how you know the actors did a very good job, because Tessa and Joel are two people who really love each other, but somehow there's no vibe there. And you feel it from the first episode, right? Like you feel like there's nothing between them. They have the utmost respect for each other, but there's no connection, right? And you can't fake a connection. So the way they were able to even like genuinely have us believe that these two would be together is crazy. We first meet Bill through a flashback, and at first I thought the flashback would follow the people being taken away by Fedra, right? Because we find out that shortly after the outbreak, the government was rounding people up and taking them to these quarantine zones. And we also find out that because there were so many people trying to get into these quarantine zones, if there wasn't enough room, the police would just shoot them and leave them be. And the logic being like, well, dead people can't be infected. So it's like, how many of these casualties were from the infected, and then how many were just from the government? That's a whole other conversation to be had. So during the flashback, I thought the man watching them through the camera was Fedra related or New World Order related. Like, again, this episode is so well shot. You're like, who is this man? Why is he watching these people? Like, is he watching to see if someone tries to escape? And then you realize it's just Bill. And during the episode, I was thinking, like, how would you prepare for something like this? Right? Like, how would you even, like what would you do? You know? And Bill's answer was like, he's been ready. He's been preparing for this his entire life. The second question I thought was like, okay, let's just say something like this were to happen, especially post-COVID. How many of y'all would go back into lockdown again, let alone follow the government to quarantine zones? Because I feel like nobody would anymore. Like, that's something I thought about, because the logic seems fine. Like, okay, the government wants to keep us safe and it's taking us to these zones. But after COVID, like, y'all, I don't know, comment down below, because Bill was doing all the right things. I was like, he's onto something. And so the city is evacuated and Bill starts to live an introvert's dream. He really became the smartest guy in the room. Everything about that house was ready for doomsday, right? He had a list. He clearly has watched like enough videos to know exactly what kind of materials he needed. He knew exactly what he had to do to keep the lights on in the house. The man can cook, right? Like, he's a chef. Like, he's really prepared for this day. Right, like he really is the type of guy to be in the basements consuming every Reddit thread. But today it paid off. I think this episode worked for two reasons. First, the acting. Like, these two, Bill and Frank, like, I don't know how they were able to capture that love, and that it's so relatable regardless of how you identify. The second reason it worked is that the transition seemed like effortless. Like, you go from 2003 to present day 2023, and it worked because you don't really know what's on the other side, right? Like, this episode didn't really waste a minute. He kept teasing us with something, right? Like every time we transition from time period to time period, you have, like, it kind of plays on your expectations of something bad happening, right? Like you're waiting for the bad thing to happening. And this tension is felt right from the start of the episode, right? Like you don't know what to expect from the characters until the story's over, right? It keeps you hanging until the very end. And so, for example, so let's start with Frank. My first impressions of Frank were not a good one. Like right from the start, the way they shot that scene, I was like, okay, he's either Fedra. I was waiting for him to say something like, okay, you have 5 seconds to, get out of the house. So according to Frank, he was in Baltimore, QZ, so something happened. So I guess some of these quarantine zones are gone. Why they're gone, we don't know. He traveled with a group of 10 and now he's the only person left, right? So he's kind of desperate. He doesn't know what to do. And I'm not gonna lie, I did not trust Frank. He was just giving off like swindler vibes, right? I was like, I'm not so sure about this man. And hesitantly, Bill lets him into the house. And I couldn't tell if Bill was paranoid. I couldn't tell if he was contemplating, like, should I just kill this man? Like, I don't know what to do. He has cameras all over the place, but he's not really sure. Or I couldn't really tell if he wanted to just give it all up to this man, right? He looked like he was like, I'm like, are you attracted or are you like scared? What are we doing here? And I couldn't believe how they kind of built up the attraction, right? So we spent enough time with Frank to know that he's an introvert and he seems to really enjoy spending his time alone, right? Every night he eats dinner, he watches the infected get trapped in his booby traps, and he's having a great time. There's no indication that this man is lonely or sad in any way, right? He's been alone his whole life. And what are the odds of you meeting someone in a pandemic that you're attracted to and that you like, right? Like, I think it's funny because I think most of us would be forced to settle. Like, right, because you would have to go with someone that was useful. Whether or not you like that person would be irrelevant. But in this case, Frank gets the best of both worlds. First time Frank and Bill have dinner, it had to be the most awkward dinner of all time, right? Like there's this tension. There's this like, you don't really know where this tension is coming from. And Frank was not helping himself in any way. So one of the reasons I distrusted Frank is because he was way too comfortable in that house. He was taking extra long showers. He was checking the place for dust. Like he couldn't believe. He's like, you know what, maybe I can make this house a home, right? Like I couldn't tell why he was scouting the place. Is he just killing time until somebody else comes? And then on the flip side, I couldn't really tell why Bill kept feeding him. It's like, okay, I thought you wanted this man out of your house, right? He's like, do you want more? Do you want more? And he's like, I'm good. After dinner, we get to the scene at the piano. And this scene at the piano had me like, I didn't know what to think, right? So Frank, being nosy, mind you, this man had a gun to his head, starts sifting through all his things, like his piano, and he kind of identified what kind of person Frank is right away. Like he could tell his vibe. And so they take turns singing like this song. And Frank asks, like, how is it that Bill is able to sing so passionately? Like, who's the girl in his life? And then Bill says, no girl. And then when Frank says, I know, that part when he was like, I know. He was so confident, right? Like Frank kind of felt the vibe. He jumped on the opportunity and it was reciprocated. And this kind of builds their relationship. And again, I don't know how they were able to capture this for so long, like how they kind of got the spark to this blind trust, to letting, being in the same bedroom as this person. Like it was just, what was supposed to be a few days turns into several years, right? So this transition from their honeymoon to when they first met to like them just being a regular couple was very well done, right? So we fast forward just at the end of their love at first sight meeting, and they're just a regular couple and they hate each other's guts. This episode makes several time jumps, but it never really feels like a time jump. Like they feel effortless. You're not like, oh, now we're in 2007. And the time differences are eerie because you don't really see or feel the effects until like you have a full picture, right? Until you're like, you compare how they look 2023 to how they looked in 2003. So the first way they're able to successfully kind of convince us of these time jumps is through this house, right? Like once they kind of commit to being with each other, Frank makes it his business to try to make this neighborhood his home. And he says something interesting, like paying attention to things is how we show love, right? It doesn't really matter where you live. you still need to care about it in some way. And I was thinking about Joel's place and how raggedy it was, right? And how beat up it was. And, you know, granted, he lives in the city and all these things, but I think this effort to try and, like, when you compare Joel and Tess, like, they were just existing with each other, whereas these guys were living with each other. On top of these sort of like renovations of the neighborhood itself, the house itself is decorated, right? Like, it seems cleaner over time. There are paintings all over the wall. There's a garden. There's all these small things and small details that, as things start to jump, you kind of see like how well kept everything is. But it's clear they've been through a lot. Like, that's one of the surprising things about this episode. Like, you don't really get a lot of like action, but you get one scene where they're raided. But then I was thinking, like, how many times have they been raided before, right? Like, we didn't see it. Like, I'm sure there's been a few times, but it's not obvious, but you kind of feel it in their vibe over time. On top of all the decorations and the way the house looks, in terms of like defensively, like, this house looks really well kept, right? So I don't think, and a lot of that has to do, it's suggested through the relationship between Bill and Joel. So there's a scene when they're raided at night, and that raid basically indicates to us that Bill and Joel and Tess and Frank have been working together for a long time. And the way that Bill was able to kind of fend off these raiders was really interesting, because it was state of the art, right? Because at some point before he met Frank, they were just kind of going on tripwires, and then after he met Frank and after he met Joel, suddenly they have fire and they have electrocution. So the house itself, from like decoration to just security, it's like very well balanced, right? So Bill and Frank were able to kind of have that happy medium. And I think what was supposed to be a liability ends up being a lifesaver, because had Frank not started talking to random people on this walkie-talkie, to be honest, Bill would probably be dead, right? Like, the odds of Bill surviving for that long would be slim to none, right? Because it's Frank who introduces them to Tess and Joel, and it's Tess and Joel who I think give them the gear they need to properly defend their home, right? Because over time, there's just no way, like, all the things that Bill had done, it would eventually wear out. So besides the house, in terms of decoration and in terms of like security, the other thing I enjoyed about these time jumps is how they were able to age them quite gracefully. Like, you don't even notice the aging. Like, the time I noticed the aging is when they had that dinner between Joel, Tess, Frank, and Bill, like when they're all just sitting there. Like, I couldn't help but think, like, wow, they all look really good, especially when you compare them to now. And that dinner scene was great for a lot of reasons. Again, like, just a side note, I don't understand why Joel was calling her, he basically called it a situationship, right? Like, he wasn't really claiming Tess in any way. And I can't imagine being in a situationship during a pandemic. And again, like, love is not easy to find, right? Like, Joel and Tess have every reason to love each other, but Joel is not claiming this woman. Whereas Frank and Bill just met, and yet they have more love. And, you know, anyways, that's a whole other conversation. The relationship between Bill and Joel is interesting because they don't like each other very much, right? So from that first meeting, you could tell that Bill was just on edge, right? He's kind of in that dilemma where he wants to make Frank happy, but at the same time, he doesn't like these people. And that awkward moment when he has like that gun, like that whole dinner scene was awkward because he has a gun pointed at these people. They're trying to eat. They can't really relax. He doesn't know what to do, right? He doesn't know whether to take it out or to put it back in. Like, he's so socially awkward that it just doesn't even make any sense. And the only reason this relationship progressed forward is because of Tess and Frank, right? So they are the ones that came up with the codes. They are the ones exchanging guns and like giving each other resources. Like, they're the ones facilitating this relationship, because if it was up to Joel and Bill, like, there would be no relationship. So after the raid, I really assumed that either like one of them would be dead or one of them would be severely injured. I never imagined that somebody would be Frank. So we make another time jump and we find Frank in a wheelchair. And that was really well done. And he's dying of an incurable disease. So it seems up until this point they have survived. You know, like, no one has been shot again. Like, they've been able to kind of maintain their space for a long time. But, you know, poor Frank is dying of a disease that he would have been dying of regardless of a pandemic or not. Right, so if the infected doesn't kill you, I mean, there's still other stuff like cancer You know, like there's other incurable diseases, and without medical treatment, you're kind of out of luck. So Frank is in an unbelievable amount of pain, and I have to say, like some of the lines in this episode, they should be put on t-shirts. Like, it was so well done. So there's a scene when Frank and Bill are sitting there. Frank is exhausted. You know, he's trying not to hurt Bill's feelings. That room, if you look at that room that they're in, it feels like a home, right? You have the paintings on the wall. Like, it's so subtle, like it's not obvious, but you feel it, right? Like their connection is helped by their surroundings and how they were able to create their surroundings. And Frank is tired, you know, he tells Bill, like, okay, love me the way I want you to, and essentially let me go, right? And it's crazy because, like, I do think love makes people do the craziest things, but I also think it makes people say the craziest things. And some of the lines coming out of the show, like, you know, I was never afraid until I met you. Like, I just, it really took me back, right? And it's funny because when you're living in such a dire situation, you know, it's not a cure that keeps you alive, right? It's either people or just simple satisfactions, right? Like whether it be a strawberry, you know, a flower, a glass of wine, like these things keep you wanting to live until the next day. So Frank literally had to fight, you know, Bill tooth and nail to make this place a home. And initially I was on Bill's side, you know, when he was talking about resource management. I was like, yep, you don't need a garden, you don't need any of this. But as they're spending their last few moments together, right, going to this boutique, you know, getting dressed up, putting the ring on, it was worth it, right? And I think all these things spiritually helped Bill live a lot longer than maybe he would have, right? There's no doubt in my mind that if the Raiders hadn't killed Bill, the stress of living in such a place probably would have killed him, right? So even just keeping your spirits alive is really important, right? And you can't really do that if you don't care about anything. We get to this dinner, and this dinner is like relationship goals. Like, it was tragic and romantic at the same time, right? So they kind of go from two strangers sitting at opposite ends of the table to sitting side by side, right? And like, talk about till death do us part. And I thought it was like, Bill is such a man, right? He doesn't tell Frank that he's already laced their drink, right? He lets him enjoy the dinner, and, you know, when it's too late, he kind of informs him that he's been lacing it. And the way Bill talks to Frank, he's like, listen, this isn't a tragedy. You know, this isn't just about you. This is about me as well. You know, I'm old, I'm satisfied, and you are my purpose, right? Like, I'm good. You know, if you want to end it here, we're partners, through better or for worse. You know, we're gonna dine together, and we're gonna die together. Oh, you know, when he said that, and the way he kind of let Frank go without letting him know was, wow. It was just so well done. And their last scene is of Bill kind of strolling him into the room, and they kind of die in each other's arms, right? They dine and die in each other's arms. Before I discuss this, like, very beautiful closing scene, I just want to talk about Ellie and Joel for a second, and then we'll circle back to the end. So the episode begins with the aftermath of Tess's death, and Joel is wounded and he's angry, right? He's kind of stacking these rocks, which I think is supposed to be like in memoriam for Tess, right? Like, normally when you stack rocks like this, it's like you're letting people know you were here. And not only that, he's having trouble even pretending to care about Ellie anymore. You know, he's over it. You know, it's like, okay, let's just say we find this cure. It's not going to cure his daughter. You know, it's not going to find his brother. It's not going to bring back Tess. So why should he care? You know, and he's over it. And Ellie's over him, right? She's like, listen, you made a choice to save me. You need to take responsibility for your choice, right? Like, whatever you're going through, you always knew there was going to be a risk. So stop blaming me. And I think with Ellie and Joel, they already don't really vibe. And it's not help. Like, they don't naturally click. You know, like, at the end, they start developing this relationship, but you can tell, like, they're not each other's. I mean, talk about connections. Like, it's like a forced connection. During their journey, Ellie asks him a lot of questions, but they're all the right questions at the wrong time. And for Ellie, this is a brave new world, right? She's never been in the woods before. She's never seen a plane crash. She's never seen a grocery store or a house, right? So all these things, she's like, she can't believe her eyes, right? She's kind of in shock. And so during their conversation, we find out that, like, how the pandemic spread. And it's quite terrifying because it seems like certain foods became contaminated right away. And these foods are pretty common, like bread, flour, pancake mix. And the way they were contaminated is that they were sold through, certain brands are sold all over the world. And so people were buying these contaminated products all over the world. And so everybody got sick at the same time. And within the course of a weekend, the world ended. And the idea that a disease can spread because certain brands are just, basically have monopolies over certain products is quite terrifying. Because it's one thing if one product is infected, but if that one product is bought by most people around the world, I mean, that changes things, right? So the way the disease spread, I'm glad they explained that bluntly. No one knows for sure how it spread, but it's kind of eerie because it feels entirely believable. And so Joel and Ellie, it's interesting because you guys tell me, I think sometimes Joel tells Ellie way too much. And he kind of forgets the fact that Ellie was not around before the pandemic, right? She's not aware of law and order, right? She doesn't really understand these things. She doesn't, he's so concerned. He sees her as a child. He's trying to protect her, right? He's like, I don't want you to see these dead bodies. I don't want you to, but she's been surrounded by death and dying her whole life. And I think the scene that indicated that was when they first went to the convenience store. So poor Joel is trying to stock up on resources, and Ellie's annoying. But based on her sort of tension with Joel, I kind of understand why she wants a gun. So throughout this episode, she's looking for a gun. She's looking for a gun, any weapon. And as annoying as she is, I understand why, right? She needs a fail-safe unless something goes wrong. And Joel isn't really making her feel secure. And so in her attempts to find something, she finds this secret door while Joel is doing his business. And she encounters one of the infected. So first thing, why did she take that box of tampons? Did she know what a tampon is? I didn't really understand. I'm like, why do you need that? Do you know what that is? Would she know what that is? I don't think they would have Tampax in the QZ. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being ignorant. Maybe I'm wrong. So anyway, she finds it infected, and then she has luckily for her, the infected was trapped. And the whole time she was snooping around, I thought something bad was going to happen. And I was waiting for something bad to happen. And instead, Ellie literally stabs this thing. And the way she stabbed him was without remorse, right? And again, she has no concept of law and order. These are not people to her. They're just things you have to kill, right? So I think Joel underestimates Ellie's mentality and kind of the state of mind that she's in. She is not a pre-pandemic kid, right? She's generation apocalypse, maybe giving her a gun would not be such a bad idea. Joel and Ellie finally make it to Frank and Bill's place. He can already tell there's something wrong, right? So the flowers are dead, the house is dilapidated. He's not so sure about it. And the room is locked. Before Ellie starts reading this letter, he says, you know what? They're dead, aren't they? The way he kind of jumped to that conclusion, you could tell that was his breaking point. There's only so much a man can take. And he's done everything he can, but he doesn't really know why he's doing it anymore. And so Ellie is reading this note, and just as a side note, he she doesn't really understand, there's no texting during this time, so she's reading it verbatim, and she's not really getting the nuance of it. So that was interesting. And as she's reading the letter, he literally has to stop her, take the paper, and leave the room because he's really contemplating what to do next, right? I think he's really thinking damn, do I leave her here? Do I not? And Bill's letter was really funny because he's like, listen, I don't like you as much as you don't like me, but here are some motivating words, right? People like me and you are here to save people, so you need to sort yourself out, right? And I think Joel is really depressed because he has the desire to save people, but he feels like he's been doing a very bad job at it. But something about reading that letter reignited his flame, and we know that he's serious again because he starts giving Ellie orders, right? He turns into Captain Joel. He's just listen, you have to do what I say. You can never bring up Tess again. I don't want to talk about our situationships or our past. We're gonna keep these hard boundaries, And these boundaries are less for her, but more for him, right? Like he's kind of, I feel like the reason he put boundaries there is to prepare him for the reality that he might lose her. And so he's trying to protect himself, right? He's like, well, if I get attached to you and you die, then that's it. And Ellie's like, yeah, sure, whatever. And I was kind of concerned because Joel basically laid out his entire evil plan, right? He's like, I want to find my brother. He works for the Fireflies. And if we can find these people, maybe they can help you. I don't know how good of an idea that was to tell her everything, but we'll find out later. The last few minutes packing up their supplies. And now we realize what the radio was from episode 1. So at the end of episode 1, there was a radio signal playing a song, and we didn't really know why they were playing that song. So I think that song was playing as an indication of Bill and Frank's death. Like that's what I gathered. And so they're gathering these supplies. Joel is happy to finally get his car battery, right? So they can finally drive. They get clothes. There's a scene where they're taking out toilet paper, and I really laughed because shout out to the people stocking up on toilet paper. Like, I don't understand that because I live in a different part of the world and nobody was stacking up on toilet paper. Like, literally nobody was doing that. So what people's impulses during like pandemics, it's like the weirdest thing. It's like, why do you think you need toilet paper to survive? What does that have to do with COVID? Like, so I don't know. I just feel like that was kind of like shade to the people doing that. And so the biggest revelation at the end of this is that Ellie finally gets her gun, and she gets Frank's gun. So she finds the gun in the same drawer that Frank took out the gun during the raid. And so she keeps the gun. And the problem with guns is that you know it's going to go off. You just don't know who it's going to go off on and when it's going to go off, right? She finally has this gun. She has a knife. She's ready to go. So we get to the final scene, and this was cute because Ellie's never been in a car. You know, like she doesn't know what a seatbelt is. She doesn't know what any of these things are. And the more that she doesn't know, the more it kind of alerts you to the fact that like they are on 2 different planets, right? And they're driving off, and the last sort of moments together, like I kind of felt this when you see them driving off and their backs are to the camera. It felt like they were finally on the same, like he was kind of, he looked alive again. And so they find this cassette player, and it's the same song that was playing when Bill and Frank first met. And, you know, of course, you know, poor Ellie doesn't know what a cassette player is, let alone what this song is. But the song plays and it kind of cuts out to like a window. And I thought that was a really nice way to end it because, again, they don't show us the bodies. They don't show us anything. There's no bad ending. There's no twist. There's no, you know, like, why was that room really locked? The whole idea of the window is like, you know, it's a brand new day and there's always something to live for, right? And so even in the worst moments, you can still keep going. So overall, I thought this was a solid episode. I was impressed by how well shot it was. And I was impressed by how it was just very well written. And it was just very confident, you know, like it didn't feel scattered. It didn't feel like they had a goal. Not everyone will receive that, but they did it. So you guys let me know what you think, and until next time.